Today, I want to address head-on two issues that might already have been nagging at you. One thing that is required of all theories of free will is an explanation for why we believe in free will at all. And we'll begin today by considering that question. Then we'll turn to a problem that arises for those who deny free will, who claim that there's no such thing as free will. The problem there is, if we don't have free will, how can we reconcile that with the idea of deliberating? How can we reconcile it with the idea that there are certain things that we should do? So telling somebody, you should do this or you ought to do that. How can that make sense if we don't have free will? So to begin with the question of the belief in free will, some philosophers have suggested that the belief in libertarian free will, that there's a kind of free will that's at odds with determinism, is a pervasive feature of human life, that it's just part of common sense that we make undetermined choices. As mentioned in Lecture 8, recently several philosophers and psychologists have begun studying empirically what people think about philosophically important issues like free will. In one recent experiment, U.S. subjects were first told about a universe in which everything that happens is completely caused by what happened before it. For anything that happens in this universe, it had to happen, given what came before. And that includes human decision-making. This description is, of course, just a rough, intuitive description of a deterministic universe. It doesn't use the word determinism because you can't presume that the participants would know that. But then the participants were given another universe that was described for them in which almost everything that happens in the universe is completely caused by what happened before it. The one exception is human decision-making. In this other universe, it was said, when a person makes a decision, it didn't have to happen, because in this universe, when it comes to human decision-making, it is not the case that every decision is completely caused by what happened before it. So all the participants got both of those descriptions, and then they were asked, which universe is most like ours? And the result was the vast majority of the participants said that our universe was most like the one in which human decision-making is not completely caused by what happened before. That is, participants tended to say that the universe in which we live, in that universe, human decisions are not determined. Thomas Reid maintained that the belief in free will was in fact a human universal. He thought that everybody in every culture believes in this. And while there's been no systematic anthropological study of free will, there's certainly no anthropological evidence that conflicts with Reid's claim that the belief in free will is a cultural universal. And some contemporary philosophers who reject free will altogether also think that the idea of free will is a cultural universal. So Galen Strawson, whose work we saw in the last lecture, writes in one of his early books, "It is in our nature to take determinism to pose a serious problem for our notions of responsibility and freedom." So there's some precedent for the idea that the belief in free will is culturally ubiquitous. On the other hand, there's a growing body of evidence in cross-cultural psychology that suggests that there are systematic cultural differences in ways of thinking. And most of the research has shown up differences between Westerners and non-Westerners. That's turned out to be the most important distinction. So in one study, Westerners, or in a range of studies actually, Westerners are found to focus on categories, and Chinese participants anyway are more likely to focus on relationships. So one illustration of this, there's a study in which the participants, Western and Chinese, were all shown pictures of a cow, a chicken, and grass. And they were asked to indicate which of these two items go best together. Westerners tend to put the chicken and the cow together because we are likely to group by category membership. And the best category to apply here is animal. That's the one that is most informative. The Chinese subjects tended to put the cow and the grass together because that reflects the most salient relationship. Cows eat grass. So this is just one example of a huge body of evidence that's accumulated over the last 15 years, showing surprising cultural differences in the way Westerners and non-Westerners think about the world. And some have suggested that even the Western notion of the self is culturally specific. The existence of these cultural differences in other domains recently led some researchers to wonder whether the U.S. results described above about free will were culturally specific. So U.S. subjects tended to think that human decision-making was not determined. But what would other cultures think? To that end, the same description of determinism and indeterminism was given to participants in India, Hong Kong, Colombia, as well as the U.S. And the question was, will there be differences? And the research suggested that there were no dramatic cultural differences at all. On the contrary, in each of these cultures, there was a tendency to reject the idea that human decision-making is determined. And now, these are incredibly early days, the earliest of days for this kind of research. So we can't draw any broad conclusions, but so far, the evidence certainly fits with the ideas of Reid and Strawson that the belief in free will be a universal fact. Reid also maintained that the belief in free will emerges very early in development. There's not much work in developmental psychology on children's understanding of free will, but there is one study suggesting that children as young as 3 years old have some appreciation of the idea of free will. In this study, half of the children were asked about a physical object. So in one case, it was a box with a sliding lid that there was a ball resting on the top of the box. And when the experimenter opened the lid, the ball fell into the box. And the experimenter asked the child, after the lid was open, did the ball have to touch the bottom, or could it have done something else instead? And nearly all the kids said that the ball had to touch the bottom. The other half of the children saw the experimenter open the box and touch the bottom of the box herself. And then she asked, after the lid was open, did I have to touch the bottom, or could I have done something else instead? In this case, every single child said that the experimenter could have done something else instead. On the one hand, this won't be very surprising to those who have familiarity with 3-year-olds, because you know that 3-year-olds are proficient with this. On the other hand, this idea that a person could have done otherwise is philosophically extremely difficult. It's a deep claim that someone did something but could have done something else. Philosophers continue to struggle over what it means and over how it could be true, what might make that kind of a claim true. And yet very young children, these were 3- and 4-year-olds, seem to wield this notion accurately and effortlessly. If the belief in libertarian free will is universal and early emerging, as I've been suggesting, there's some reason to think that's a strong possibility. Then we should ask, how does this come about? In addition to just the intrinsic interest of wondering, how do people come to believe the things they do, it's attracted philosophical attention for several reasons. Libertarians typically want to maintain that we come to believe in free will on the basis of good evidence of free will. That is, our belief in free will is well grounded, and so they need to tell a story about how the way we come to believe in free will gives it some kind of justification, gives it some kind of warrant, gives that belief some kind of heft for really trusting it. For free will skeptics, on the other hand, to make their view plausible, they need to explain away our belief in free will. They need to say, well, yeah, you have this belief in free will. There's no such thing as free will. But here's why you believe that. Here's the defective basis on which you came to think that you had free will. So they need a story as well. But we could also just approach this issue without a prior commitment. You could stand back and say, you know, I'm not sure whether we have free will or not, but maybe if I found out why we came to believe in free will, then that could help me decide whether or not that belief is justified. So some philosophers think that we don't have the evidence at this point to settle decisively whether or not free will exists. But if we can find out why we have the belief, then we might have a better sense for whether that belief is justified. When libertarians try to explain why we believe in free will, they typically appeal to experience, the experience of choosing. That's why we believe in free will. So Reid maintains that we believe in free will because of our conscious awareness of our choices. And he goes so far as to suggest that this provides us with the fundamental idea of causation that we then apply to objects in the world like billiard balls. That is, he thinks it's only because we experience ourselves as causes that we come to regard worldly events as causal. Contemporary libertarians don't go as far as Reid. They don't go so far as to say our very notion of causation comes from our experience of choice. But they still typically maintain that experience provides the basis for our conviction of free will. So if you'll remember, Campbell said, quote, "The appeal is throughout to one's own experience." And then he says, "When we decide to exert moral effort to resist a temptation, we feel quite certain that we could withhold the effort." And it's that sort of experience, libertarians think, that gives us the belief that we have free will. At first glance, this seems really attractive, I think. It does seem plausible that we experience our actions as free. But if we ask, how does this experience actually lead to the belief, it becomes a bit trickier to say how that could work. So how could the experience generate the belief in free will? Sometimes, no doubt, experience gives us ideas directly. So the idea of pain or the idea of sweet. When you have some trauma to your body, you get the idea of pain immediately. You don't need any kind of conceptual sophistication to have the mental state, I'm in pain, or that this tastes sweet. But these ideas, the idea of pain and sweet, are very simple. And the belief in libertarian free will is really quite complex. For one thing, it includes the idea that determinism is false. And determinism itself is a complex theoretical position. And it's quite unclear how experience could directly produce the belief that the theory of determinism is false. Certainly, it's not plausible that experience does it the way we get the idea of pain. It's not plausible that experience directly produces the belief in free will the way it directly produces ideas like pain and sweet. And until we get a more detailed answer about how the experience could generate this really complicated belief that determinism is false, this kind of explanation is unsatisfying. We don't have enough of a story yet to be comfortable saying, oh yeah, we get the belief from experience, now we can all pack up and go home. Hard determinists who reject free will offer a different explanation for why people believe in free will. They typically maintain that we believe in free will because we fail to see the real causes of our decisions. So one of the early free will skeptics was a philosopher named Baruch Spinoza. He was a Jewish philosopher who lived from 1632 to 1677. And he grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community, but was excommunicated, apparently for his radical views. Spinoza rejected free will. He thought free will didn't exist, and he said that the reason people believe in free will is the following. Men believe themselves to be free, he said, simply because they are conscious of their actions and unconscious of the causes whereby those actions are determined. Dolbach, who we saw also rejects free will, tells basically the same story. He says, a person thinks he's a free agent only because he can't perceive the chain of causes within his mind. We might call this proposal acquisition through ignorance, because the claim is that we believe in free will because we're ignorant. We believe in it because of our ignorance about the causes. Now, such an explanation has some evidence in its favor. As we'll see in Lecture 15, there's evidence from psychology that, in fact, we don't recognize all of the causal factors that influence our behavior. I'll describe this in some detail in that lecture, but let me just give you one example that's pretty simple just to give you an idea of how this plays out. It turns out that merely exposing a person to something, say a piece of music, a shape, a face, tends on average to increase their liking for that thing. That's why, for instance, professional success in pop music depends heavily on how often one song gets played, songs get played on the radio or on MTV. This is known as the familiarity effect. Familiarity breeds liking. Strikingly, though, the familiarity effect happens even when the stimulus is presented so fast that it doesn't get consciously registered. So, in one experiment, subjects were briefly flashed some Chinese characters, and they were subsequently found to rate more positively the characters that they'd been exposed to. This was despite the fact that they couldn't recognize the characters that they were exposed to. They didn't even know that they'd seen the characters. And yet this exposure, this unconscious exposure, influenced what they preferred. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg. lots and lots of what guides behavior is caused in ways that are completely hidden from consciousness. And as I said, we'll see a larger case for this in Lecture 15. On this score, then, the acquisition through ignorance account certainly seems to get part of the story confirmed. We are ignorant of some of the factors that cause our behavior. Spinoza and Dolbach were quite right about that. But the theory of acquisition through ignorance also remains incomplete. It's not a general truth that when we're ignorant of the cause of an event, we conclude that the event wasn't determined. So just because I don't know the particular cause of an event doesn't make me think that the event wasn't determined. So to take a really simple example, suppose I get what is obviously a case of food poisoning, but I don't know which particular food caused the illness. I would never come to the conclusion from that my illness was not caused by some particular food. I wouldn't conclude that the food poisoning was undetermined simply because I was ignorant of which dish caused it. So ignorance in general doesn't tell me that I don't have a kind of deterministic story to tell. So even if it's true that we're ignorant of the causes of our behavior, that doesn't fully explain why we jump all the way to the conclusion that we have indeterminate free will. A very different approach here is to maintain that people are born with an innate concept of free will. The appeal to innate ideas has been enjoying a resurgence in recent years. It's had intermittent popularity in philosophy, but now there are a number of prominent philosophers and psychologists who defend the view, based in large part on developmental psychology work that suggests that babies have a large body of innate capacities, or what gets called core knowledge. And one area of this that's suggested to be innate is the area of intuitive physics, including the notion of causation. Much of this research is based on what infants find interesting as measured by how long they look at a presentation. So you show infants something until they get bored with it, and then you see what kinds of subsequent presentations they will find interesting. In one experiment on causation, 6-month-old infants watched as an object moved behind a barrier, and then another object comes out the other side. Infants are shown this until they get tired of it, and then they're shown the scene without the barrier. It's as if they're seeing the very same scene that's already been repeated several times, but now without the barrier. One group sees the first object move, make contact with the second object, which then moves. Infants find this boring too. But the other group of infants sees the first object move toward the second object, but fail to make contact with that second object, and the second object moves anyway. This the infants find interesting. They look significantly longer at that stimulus. And this suggests that a violation of what the infant expects. The infant expects that in order for one object to cause another one to move, it has to make contact. Hence, this is called the contact principle. And it's presumed by these developmental psychologists to be part of the infant's core knowledge. So this is just a tiny example of a large body of research that people think suggests that infants come preloaded with causal principles. Researchers have also maintained that core parts of our folk psychology are also innate. And part of the evidence here is that children with autism seem to have particular deficits in understanding other minds. Deficits that are not found in other children who are delayed in their cognitive development. So if we come to have innate bits of folk psychology, maybe we have an innate notion of agent cause as well. But many find appeals to innateness problematic for any case. And for something as complex as the idea of agent cause, one might be particularly skeptical about the idea that this is somehow programmed into our brains before we even get any kinds of experiences. So the idea that the notion of agent cause is innate is not something that psychologists and philosophers are completely on board with. There aren't a lot of philosophers who would embrace that idea. So none of the three proposals that I've suggested are obviously right. They're not conclusively shown that any of these stories gives a full explanation for why we believe in free will. Now I want to turn to a very different question. Often when I give public talks on free will, someone will point out that the determinist ends up saying some weird and maybe incoherent things. Basically, the worry is that the determinist will say, Bill, you should give to charity. But if it's already determined whether or not Bill will give to charity, how can the determinist tell Bill what he should do? How does that even make sense? So philosophers think that the hard determinist who rejects the belief in free will does end up with some kind of problem about deliberation. This harks back to the lazy argument from lectures 4 and 5, and I won't rehearse that argument again, but it's possible that what lies behind that argument is just the sense that it's weird to think that what I do is determined, and yet I should still deliberate about what to do. So let's tackle these issues directly. When we deliberate about what to do, it seems that we presuppose that we have free will. It seems like when we're trying to decide whether to do A or B, we believe that it's possible to do either of them. But the hard determinist maintains that there really are no open possibilities. Everything we decide is an inevitable consequence of what happened in the past. If you believe that, it suggested, it would be impossible to deliberate. If you believe that everything was fixed already, it would be impossible to go through the process. Because in order to deliberate, you have to believe that it's possible for you to do either action. One philosopher gives the following example as a kind of analogy. He says, suppose you were in a room with 2 doors. One of them is locked, but you don't know which one. Does it make sense to say that you deliberate about which door to go through? Of course not, he says. You can't deliberate about which one to go through because you can't go through one of them. There's something here that I think is troubling, but we need to get clear about some things that aren't so troubling, that aren't affected by these arguments. So, first of all, many animals probably do something that we can call minimal deliberation. They have competing drives or interests, and their brains do some calculations to figure out the best course of action. We could squabble over whether that really counts as deliberation, but that's not that important. That's not that interesting here. This kind of minimal deliberation, though, is present in monkeys and rats and crows. Moreover, much of our own action is probably driven by this kind of unreflective calculation of costs and benefits. But it's a bit crazy to think that the rats can't do this unless they think that determinism is false, or to put it another way, it's crazy to think that the rat can't do this minimal deliberation unless the rat believes that there are genuinely undetermined possibilities open for him. Nothing that sophisticated is required for minimal deliberation. So it isn't that we can't do any kind of deliberating without believing that there are genuinely undetermined open possibilities, because we probably often engage in this very minimal kind of deliberation that runs well below any kind of concern about theoretical questions concerning determinism. But in addition to this minimal deliberation, there's another kind of deliberation that we all do, but hamsters don't. We do reflective, conscious deliberation. I think to myself quite consciously, I need to make a decision now. Maybe this reflective version of deliberation does depend on the belief that determinism is false. Often in philosophy, to get to the root of a problem, it's important to develop somewhat different variations. So I want to present a somewhat different way of framing the same kind of problem. And it's in terms of what philosophers call the maxim that ought implies can. So when we say that a person ought to do something, we typically presume that they can do it. If I say that Sue ought to help the injured child to the sidewalk before the car hits the child, this implies that Sue can help the injured child to the sidewalk before the car hits the child. If it were impossible for her to help, it would be bizarre to say that she ought to help. Suppose, for example, that the injured child is in Baltimore and Sue is in Vancouver. It would be inappropriate and unfair to say that Sue ought to help the injured child to the sidewalk. It's impossible for her to do that. If I say that she ought to help, this implies that her helping is actually a possibility. Seen in this light, the problem with deliberation is that when I'm deliberating between doing A or B, I'm trying to figure out whether I ought to do A or B. But that presupposes that I can do either one of them, that either option is genuinely open to me. But that's what the hard determinist denies. The hard determinist says that whether I do A or B is already determined. But in that case, how can I make sense of trying to decide whether to do A or B? Let's say someone tells me that I ought to join a gym. How does this even make sense? It's inevitable that I either will join a gym or I won't join a gym. So how can it be sensible to say that I ought to do it? There might be a real dizzying question here for hard determinism, but there are a number of different things that can be said in their defense that will at least partly address the problem. First, it's important to distinguish determinism from the fatalism of Lecture 2. Fatalism claims that what happens to us is inevitable regardless of what we decide. That really would lead to a sense of futility. But the hard determinist fully rejects this claim. What we decide has a great effect on what happens to us. The hard determinist maintains that this is because our decisions are among the causal factors that determine what happened to us. What we do doesn't somehow stand outside the causal order. Our decisions aren't somehow happening in some other realm. So determinism can accommodate the idea that decisions affect our behavior. Furthermore, even if determinism is true, it might make sense to deliberate so long as we don't know what we're going to do. Harking back to some of the earlier lectures, if I already know what I'm going to do and why, then there's no point in my deliberating. Let's say I know that I'll be at the ballet on Sunday afternoon because my spouse is going to drag me there whether I want to or not. Then there's no point in me deliberating about where to be at that time. It's just a dead loss. But if I don't yet know what I'm going to do on Sunday afternoon, then even if what I'll do is already determined, it might make sense for me to deliberate because through deliberation I arrive at my reasons for favoring one action over another. Now, this might seem like it's still not getting to the nub of the issue. So let's return to our other way of framing the problem, in terms of the idea that if someone ought to do something, that means they can do it. When a hard determinist says that a person ought to obey his parents, there are some very different things that he might mean. When you say John ought to obey his parents, what you might mean is that obeying his parents is the best decision for John. Note that this is perfectly compatible with determinism. I can say that a person failed to make the best decision even when I know that he couldn't, for whatever reason, make that decision. Also, there are several different ways to cash out best decision. It might be the morally best decision. It might be the prudentially best decision. It might be the financially best decision. But in all of those cases, I can even step back after he's already made the decision and say, I know you made that decision and it was determined, but you would be a lot better off if you'd made a different decision. That was not the best decision. So a determinist can certainly identify what the best decision is without ever shrinking from his determinism. The statement, John, you ought to obey your parents, sometimes is used in a different way, in a kind of advisory capacity where you're saying, obey your parents. This would be an attempt to influence the person. And of course, again, the determinist can say, that is fine. Giving such advice can sometimes be an effective means of modifying behavior. Of course, it doesn't always work, but it's the kind of thing that often can be good and effective. So you instruct your child, do your homework, or else. That kind of thing can generate behavior. It can modify behavior. There are lots of ways that we can manipulate behavior, and this is just one of them. We can manipulate behavior by temptations, by rewards and punishments. So there are all these different ways that the hard determinist can accommodate that kind of thing. Now, all of this has been from the third-person perspective. And you might think that the problem is much worse if we turn to the third-person perspective, or the first-person perspective, rather. So from the first-person perspective, I tell myself, I ought to join a gym, say. Certainly it's fine for this to be regarded as the best decision. Sometimes I think that I ought to do something, meaning that this will be the best decision. I think, join a gym, that's the best decision. I can list the reasons why it would be so good for me to join a gym. And I can even look back in the past and say, oh, in the past I made this decision not to join a gym. That was really dumb. The right decision would have been to join a gym. I know my decision not to join a gym was determined, but now I wish that I had decided differently because that would have been better. Even though I couldn't have decided differently, it would have been better if I had. But now, so I think for the best decision interpretation, the hard determinist is fine. I can say it would have been the best decision in the past for me to join the gym. But now let's consider the other usage I talked about, the advisory usage. This seems weird. So the idea that I can advise myself as a determinist to do something, even though whatever I do is inevitable. So here's why this seems worrying. If I'm a determinist and I say to myself, I ought to join a gym, that my decision is determined, including the decision to give myself that advice, that all of it's determined. So the puzzle is, how can a determinist intelligibly instruct himself to, say, initiate an action? If I believe determinism, then whether I initiate an action is already determined. Moreover, when I tell myself to initiate the action, even telling myself that is determined. So whereas it makes sense for me to try to give advice to intervene in the decision-making of another person, a hard determinist can definitely explain that. What sense does it make to say that I can give myself advice to intervene in my own decision-making process? Whatever I do, give myself advice, tell myself what to focus on, tell myself what not to focus on, all of that is determined. So when I tell myself, initiate the action, that particular bit of mental activity was determined. Whether I would give myself that instruction, whether I would follow that instruction, was all determined before I was born. So if I'm a determinist, what do I think I'm doing when I do those kinds of things? I think here we have some kind of residual weirdness for the hard determinist. That even though he can accommodate much of what we want out of deliberation and instruction, this seems really difficult. That at a minimum, the hard determinist can say it's a good thing to deliberate, but it's very hard for the hard determinist to explain how it makes sense for me to give myself advice or for what I ought to do.